Welcome to the Teacher in Classroom 21, a podcast by the Ever Learner. I'm James, your host. Join me and my guests every week as we discuss, debate and explore the features of a world-class classroom in the 21st century. Welcome to the Teacher in Classroom 21 podcast. I'm your host, James Sims, and joining me in person in the studio, lit by almost a single candle, we have my co-host Martha Soteros Munn, who's also the director of the Ever Learner, and we have Elle Houghton. Elle is the most recent addition to the team and is the content creator of the Ever Learner, specialising in French and Spanish, but turning her hand to a whole range of other disciplines too. Elle is an experienced languages teacher and has previously taught both maths and English in UK secondary schools. Elle was raised in central France and speaks French to an exceptional level. Elle is mother to Jack and Emily and wife to Rob. Elle is currently studying her master's degree in psychology and is a keen runner when her sore back and knees allow. Welcome to the show, guys. How are we?
Yeah, good, thank you.
Yeah, good. All right.
Yeah? Good. So, Elle, I'm going to start with you, Martha. I'm sure you're going to jump in here at times as well. But Elle, first of all, how do you currently name your profession? When people ask you the what do you do question, what do you say?
Ooh, no one's actually asked me that yet. What would I say? I think I'd still start off with, well, I used to be a teacher and I've recently started working for a company in the field of education. And I think then I'll probably go on and try and explain the role of being a content creator. But no, nothing I've had to deal with yet, and something I imagine is going to become trickier as time goes on.
It's interesting that you say that you used to be a teacher. Expand on that for us.
I suppose teacher in the sense of what everyone else understands as classroom teacher. So I no longer teach within the classroom. Obviously still working in education, still educating.
Still teaching.
Still teaching.
Yeah, in a different way.
In a different way.
How do you answer it, Martha? Because I guess it's an equivalent thing for you.
Yeah, I'd probably go a similar route. Sometimes if I can't be bothered, I might just say I'm a teacher, and people don't ask any further questions generally. So but yeah, otherwise same thing. Used to work as a teacher, now.
I think it's hard because people hear the word teacher and automatically assume classroom.
Mm-hmm.
So it's trying to explain the difference, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. But the other thing, I mean, to a large extent, we are still teachers. I suppose we don't deal with a lot of the day-to-day extra jobs that teachers have to do. We just concentrate on the teaching bit. So, yeah.
Okay, so I'll give you my answers to that as well. I say I'm a teacher. And I let other people kind of dig and explore that. Often I find what do you do is a loaded question, right? Someone will ask you it kind of knowing what you already do, or trying to, I sometimes, depending on the context, I sometimes find that people are trying to sort of establish some kind of social leveler of some kind and try to find where you are. And I like saying I'm a teacher. And I think it's a fair comment. I've been a teacher in the classroom for 16 years, and I teach every single day. So I think it's a fair description. But I think the point you mentioned there, Ellie, is an interesting one. We delineate the role of a teacher as being in a classroom and being at the front and presenting, explaining things. And I guess we don't do that anymore, right? That's the difference.
Yeah. I was just thinking, I think we all just need to find fancy names for our job so that they will leave everyone puzzled when they say, what's your job? And we'll come up with something, and they will go like, and they may not even dare asking any further.
Is it a very different experience for you guys? I mean, you're both experienced MFL teachers, and now you're working in MFL, but it's outside of that school environment. How different is the experience for you?
Very different.
Yeah. Firstly, I imagine this the stress levels and the level of physical, mental exhaustion is not the same as what it used. Funny enough, I was just saying the other day, I think it was last week, my daughter was getting me up at 5:15 every morning. And it came to the Friday night, my husband came back from work, he'd been away all week. And as I was saying, I've been up at 5:15 every day this week, and normally, a few months back, I wouldn't actually have been coping by that point. I would have been a complete mess. And, I was staying up till 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. And there's having worked a full working day, 8-9 hours that day. So it's different in that sense of, I think, not having the physical aspect in the classroom.
I mean, there are things that I'm sure I miss, and I'm sure you miss as well. That, of course, the day-to-day contact with the students, that those sort of rewarding experiences of seeing firsthand how someone is learning and how someone is improving, and how that firsthand contact with the student, with the pupil, is something that is not there. But on the other hand, it's also rewarding in other ways, because you feel that you will probably make an impact that goes beyond the impact that you would have had within the confines of your...
You feel like the impact, even though it's not as tangible because you're not seeing it on the face or in the mind of somebody, the impact is actually greater.
Exactly. Potentially, of course, the impact within your classroom is just within those four walls of your classroom and with those groups that you teach. But here, we could potentially have an impact that goes far beyond that.
Do you manage to remember that every time you're writing a question?
Definitely, every single time. It's always on the forefront.
So I guess people will be wondering, Ellie, in terms of content creating, what does that actually mean? I mean, what are you actually doing?
Well, at the moment, Marta and I have been working on the Spanish, developing the Spanish course, and where Marta has been recording the tutorials. I have been writing the questions that go alongside it to help embed that knowledge, to help the students be able to practice their vocabulary, their grammar, and putting it in context and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, and the tutorial recording for you, Marta. I mean, for people that haven't seen it, what is a tutorial in this sense? What do we mean by that?
Well, in the vocabulary context, is very often is an explanation or a exposure to a certain amount of words, and I try and make it. I try and use drawings, poorly drawn things, but hopefully obvious enough. As much as possible, I try. In every video I make, I try to use as little English as possible. Sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes when the vocabulary you have to present is abstract, or it's really difficult to explain to illustrate certain ideas well enough. So sometimes you have to resort to English as the most efficient way of doing it. But yeah, basically it's about sort of trying to expose for the first time the students to that vocabulary, to what it looks like, what it sounds like, how it might be used. I try and put it into sentences as much as possible as well, so that it's not just a word, but it can be, it's a first introduction to how it could be used within that topic. And so it's basically the videos are in the same style as the PE videos, the grammar videos, so black screen to start with generally.
That's what I was going to ask you. I mean, if we use...
You can't see me, luckily.
You were using the words tutorial video there. If you were to compare this video tutorial thing to what would be an equivalent experience in the classroom, what would it compare to most closely?
I suppose. I mean, in this case, these videos, the ones the lessons we've been doing, the course we've been doing is about vocabulary. So, I suppose it would replace, or it's instead of any lesson where you first expose the students to vocabulary, which can be used in different ways. So the repetition, going through things in a bag, a pencil, and all the students to repeat that classic thing, or that's probably the very traditional way of doing. But many, there are many different things that get used in the classroom to expose students for the first time to that vocabulary.
And is it fair to say it's probably most closely related to kind of blackboard teaching, right? Blackboard or whiteboard teaching, that's ultimately what it is. It's not a PowerPoint, for example.
Oh, no, it's not a PowerPoint, no.
Okay.
No.
And how do you make it?
With a tablet, a tablet, not as in an iPad tablet, a sort of, what's it called? Like a drawing. Yeah, it's a Wacom, but it's the sort of thing that people who do drawings, design use. So you just write on it as if you were writing on paper, and you can use different colours, and it's very good and very, very precise. It's much better than the things that we used to use at the beginning of starting recording the tutorials. It's cool.
And Ellie, we've touched a little bit on this already with something you said before, but if we reflect for a moment on what is the current experience of working in an MFL classroom, I mean, what would you describe as the main challenges that MFL teachers are facing right now? In your experience of working in schools and classrooms in recent years, what do you perceive as being the primary challenges?
Main challenges, certainly within teaching the new GCSE course, the 9-1 course, over the past year and a half. Firstly, we're dealing with the enormous amount of content that as a teacher, the students are expected to get through within the course of 2 years, not just in terms of vocabulary, but in terms of grammar. I believe the grammar that they cover now at GCSE is on a par with what we used to teach at AS level, in terms of everything they're expected to know. So just time, really, in trying to cover everything and cover everything in depth and ensure that the students can actually remember it, not just from one lesson to the next, but actually remember it long term when you're effectively having to bombard them with new vocabulary constantly. And then really trying to deal with sort of the range of students that you'll find within a typical MFL classroom. I can honestly say I don't think I've taught a GCSE class where I haven't had at least one native speaker in there to have to work alongside with, and usually you'll find someone in there who's been put into GCSE Spanish having never done it before because they're new to the school, they've transferred, so a really wide range of
Is that the widest range of performance levels that exists within secondary schools? I'm just trying to think of an equivalent. I mean, in mathematics, I guess you can have the concept of the whiz kid, and the person who's really kind of learned helplessness with maths. I mean, I guess, but the native to the beginner is perhaps the most extreme. I don't know if anything.
It's particularly challenging to cope with because a native speaker, I mean, their spoken Spanish would be far better than mine,
but
of course.
Reading and writing.
But actually, they're reading and writing, their exam technique, their spelling, their some of their grammar, those sorts of things are a challenge.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because you can, from as a layperson, I mean, I've taught a little bit of languages in my time, but not much. From the layperson perspective, it sounds like a dream that you'd have the native speaker in the classroom, but in reality, you're probably having to manage a very specific type of challenge for every individual, and in very, very, very diverse ways. That's interesting. I've never thought about that before. Is the same experience for you, Marta?
Yeah. And I was thinking, I mean, and the other thing with a native as well is that sometimes you may need a big degree of sort of corrective. Because it's not on, they may know stuff, but they may know things incorrectly because, of course, they don't. Some so-called native speakers may not have lived in the country for a long time, or they may have taken sort of, certain misconceptions, or and then doing that. That job of that corrective work might actually, is also a challenge that you don't necessarily have to do with others who are just learning what you're telling, what you're teaching. But yeah, it is challenging going to these two. extremes.
And this content factor, I mean, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. I think I already know what you're going to say to me, but I'm going to deliberately provoke you to. I'm going to say to you, it's the same in all subjects. The GCSEs have got wider and tougher and more rigorous, and that's just the way it is. And you guys have got to get on with it. I mean, what do you say back to that response?
I don't think there's any way of weighing up. We don't really want to start sort of discussing which GCSE is more difficult than the other, which one's got physically more content to get through, but you can't deny in terms of number of hours, contact hours, that languages isn't up there at the top.
Yeah.
You know, understandably, you have to prioritise number of hours with English and maths and science being necessary, I suppose, for the children to go on to college and things like that. They're the ones that they'll be looking out for. So in terms of Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4 actual physical contact hours, and a lot of the time that at Key Stage 3 it's split between two languages, I think that plays a part, definitely.
So would that be an advocation? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think also in addition to that, I think in languages you also find something that you don't find, as far as I know, I don't think you find in other subjects, where you will have you've got topics and the vocabulary associated to that, but that's only sort of indicative. It's not a closed list, it's not a closed environment. So even if a student knows the whole of the list, or knows the whole of the vocabulary, they will still come across lots of things that they don't know and they have to cope with. And I think that's great. But I think the amount of students who in languages experience a feeling of a sustained feeling of success, I think it's not very great, because I think with other subjects you study the spec, and if you know your spec you're going to do well. If you know what a leg is, when they will ask you about the leg and it's fine, they're not going to call it whatever, they're not going to find a strange name to try and trick you. In languages this can happen, so you will have learned the name for a word and then they're going to refer to it using a roundabout way instead of the word leg. And I think whilst I understand that, yeah, of course not everything can be so straightforward, I think there are too many pitfalls that make for many students it's a bit of it's quite a challenging experience.
I thought the comparison you made, Ellie, a moment ago, was interesting. You talked briefly comparatively with English, maths and science, which I think we all recognise are subjects which are elevated in the assumption of the hierarchy of importance. Whether that's justified or not is for another day. But I think what's interesting about that is that societally and culturally, those subjects are elevated in terms of their considerations. They're valued broadly across society. Everybody, even if they're not very good at it, understands the value of maths. Everybody, even if they're not very good at it, understands the value of science. And therefore, I think that leads to a far greater level of esteem, of persistence, of perseverance. And then I look at that in relation to Spanish, say, or French or German, or choose your language. And I think its cultural significance, or the position of it in the cultural hierarchy, is significantly lower in UK culture. Now, that's probably very different in Spain, in France, in Germany, and various other countries. How do you guys feel about that?
Yeah, I think unfortunately it comes as part of being an English-speaking nation, doesn't it? It's too easy to fall into using your native tongue whenever you go abroad, and the assumption that someone will speak that language, and it's quite rare to find yourself in a situation, I think, especially if you travel within Europe, for example, where you wouldn't be able to communicate with someone using English. And as you said, in other countries, they're surrounded by English thanks to the media, pop songs, TV, you name it, they're hearing English day in, day out, and I think because of that it's elevated in their societies. Whereas over here it's something that's viewed a little bit as something a bit alien that you don't really need to use, and unfortunately thanks to Google Translate it's getting worse. People don't seem to understand that you can't just take your phone with you abroad.
It's
And
interesting what you just said. There is that thing of I don't really need that. I don't really. How many times do you hear someone say, "I'd love to be able to speak a foreign language, but I don't really need to." And I wonder to what degree that cultural impression, or what impression that kind of cultural stamp makes on different individuals at the age of 14, 15, 16 in this country.
Yeah, I have the impression, I don't know if you've got the same impression, Ellie, but through having sat through many parents' evenings, I have the impression that the family, you find two types of you find like two types of parents. The parents who, I was terrible at languages, and then you've got the parents who they speak some languages, and they insist that their child works hard in that. But for some reason there is an unbelievable amount of people who they seem to feel that being able to speak a foreign language seems to be something genetic. So if the parent was rubbish, then the expectation is that the child will also be rubbish. And sometimes the child will be good and the parent will come to totally amazed, like, "Oh, I was at school, I was so bad at it, I can't believe she's so good." Well, she's a different individual and it's not genetic, you just, you can learn it. But yeah, it's amazing how much still there is this belief that it sort of runs in the family, and you can do nothing about it. I don't know, I find it quite interesting.
That is interesting. I mean, I've frequently told you my experience of my French teacher, whose name, sadly, thankfully, I don't regret. I don't remember at this point.
Probably quite good for the teacher.
But I remember her in a parents' evening at the end of year 8 saying to my parents, and I was present, saying, "He'll never be a linguist." And I think that's really had an effect on me. And I spent a lot of time in France. Actually, I used to go to France every year, more than once. And I have a real sort of mental block with regard to French. But ironically, as an adult, despite being told that by the apparent expert, I've been able to learn I'm going to refer to it as at least 3 foreign languages as an adult. Now, that doesn't map to what that colleague was saying about me. She was reinforcing that idea. Now, I'm not saying I was a good student. I was probably a pain in the ass, if I'm honest, in my 2 years of French, but there does seem to be that cultural assumption that language is one of those things that you can or can't do. And I have to say, and you guys, I don't know, may disagree, but I utterly reject that concept.
I think as humans we're designed. It's how our brains work. We can learn languages, and obviously depending on the age that you start learning them at and how you learn them will affect your degree of fluency and things like that. But of course, everyone, we can all learn languages. What makes us unique as a species.
Yeah. It's almost it's one of our superpowers, right? Yeah. If you look at bears, they're triple strong. If you look at eagles, they can see far and fly about. And, I mean, excuse my somewhat poor description of such wonderful animals, but that's what humans can do, right? Mm-hmm. They can adapt to different surroundings, and they can learn things very readily, including highly elevated language.
Yeah, I can say I can quite safely say that I am still to come across a student who I think, no, they would never be able to learn a language. I've met students who really struggled, but I would say every time I'm convinced that was because they weren't following the right steps. They weren't doing it in a way that suited them. They probably weren't spending enough time on it. They probably, I don't know, if their problem was learning vocabulary. How do you learn vocabulary? I just sit down and read a list. Right, okay. Does that work? No. Right, where do you do it? Don't know. So it tends to be more about the method. They're not using the right steps. They're not doing the right things that enables them to learn, rather than they just can't do it. Of course, they then get into a sort of a vicious circle where they've tried, they can't do it, so they convince themselves that they can't do it, and then they just can't do it because it's in their head.
So I'm going to take something. People may actually hear Mike tapping away in the background. He's got some heavy fingers on those on his mouse button. But a definition we would make in our subject of learned helplessness is a belief that failure was inevitable. And I think that what you're doing, and by the way, I exhibit that in aspects of my life as well. If I was to go, I'm taking my daughter to dance class tonight, for example. If I was to step on that floor, I guarantee you I would feel that way. So it's not like I'm alien to it, but I believe that is I think that's a common experience in language, that people believe that failure is inevitable to them, and that must have a major impact on the experience of modern foreign language teaching and learning within a classroom.
Yeah, I think languages requires a lot of resilience. I don't think you need to be, some people think, oh, they're so clever, they speak more than one language. It's not about being clever. I think a lot of it is about being resilient, about accepting that you will, before you get it right, you'll get it wrong many times, and that you, even when you then will have got it right, then you'll revert and get it wrong again. So it's about being able to fall and get up again, and maybe there are other subjects where you've got more of a safety blanket, you've got more structures around you and more things that make sure that you're going to get this right and you're going to write that correctly, and in languages that's a bit more difficult. So I think that's, for me, that's one of the keys, the resilience and the perseverance, rather than the so-called intelligence or being bright or being whatever.
I think the making mistakes things are really important. The thing, I know my sister, who hopefully won't mind being mentioned, when she moved abroad, she's not someone who likes to make mistakes at all, and she has a thing where she just quietly listens, and when she feels that she's confident enough and fluent enough, that's when she'll start speaking. But when she does start speaking, she's nearly nailed it, but she does not like making mistakes. And I think it's something if you're learning a language, you have to make mistakes constantly. As I always used to say to my students, we make mistakes in English. How many times do we start a sentence, go back and rephrase? We'll realise we've mispronounced something or we've merged two words together. It's something that we do in our native language, let alone a foreign one, and it's something you have to.
Then going back to what we were saying about the time to cover all the content, the amount of content that of course in the languages classroom, it also translates into lack of time for speaking, for example. And of course what tends to happen for many students is that the only chance when they've got of showing their speaking to the teacher is in an exam situation. So I suppose that although I suppose from the point of view of the student, you can tell or we can tell the student, oh, it's fine to make mistakes, it's no problem. But then their experience is, okay, but every time I speak, is in this it's in this context.
I get a grade,
and if I get it wrong, I fail. So you're telling me one thing, and then doing a different one. So I suppose that's
interesting, right? Because you're trying to get across. I mean, I don't mean to lean on Dweckism too heavily, but you're trying to get across the growth mindset, the role of errors, the importance of the struggle in order to learn, the flexing of the brain, all that stuff. Classic Dweck in my loose knowledge of that theory. But what we're saying here is that if a teacher achieves that in the classroom, it's in spite of the model they're using, not because the model produces the output. So I've got a presupposition for you, and I think this is going to be controversial for language teachers. Good. And this is my presupposition for you. So I wrote this down in advance. So Ellie, I wrote it to you, so I'm going to address it to you, but feel free, both of you, to answer this. So I'm going to say, Ellie, it is my presupposition that today in languages it is entirely possible to have learners learning at their own pace and at the exact challenge level that suits them. Do you agree? And how do you feel a room full of MFL teachers would respond to that suggestion?
Do I agree? I do now. Perhaps a few months ago I might have questioned how on earth that was going to be achievable. But I think once you take away the notion of there being one teacher in the classroom, one teacher to 30-35 student ratio, and having to introduce that vocabulary that we mentioned earlier for the first time, and then get the students to be practicing that vocabulary. So if you sort of step back from that typical lesson that I've probably taught thousands upon thousands of times.
What is the structure of that? What would you consider? I might use the word stock lesson. What would that look like, Ellie, in languages?
I suppose at Key Stage 4, thinking more GCSE level, it'd be starting off a recap of some language they should perhaps know already. Perhaps know. Should know.
Yeah,
perhaps,
definitely.
Don't remember. So starting off with a quick recap of that of some sort.
Blank faces all around.
And then linking that to whatever vocabulary risk I want them to gain. And assuming it's a vocabulary lesson, not a skills-based lesson or something like that. In that lesson, introducing that language in some way. At Key Stage 4, it'd probably be less emphasis on sort of speaking repetition that they would at lower school. And then getting them to practice and try, and the emphasis being on try and get them to practice that new language in all skill areas. So the idea is that in every lesson you should try and cover this speaking, listening, reading and writing, and ideally link it to some grammar. But if we're being perfectly honest, two of those would usually get skipped. Unfortunately, something takes longer than you anticipated, or and I think unfortunately you don't often get to cover.
And is this just Ellie's experience in your perception, or do you think this is pretty typical experience?
I'd like to think I've been teaching for over 10 years now, and I've had a role as an NQT mentor, PGCE mentor, as a head of department. I've been fortunate enough to be able to watch other people teach, and through my own personal CPD as well, going to observe colleagues and everything else. And I think, it's certainly typical of what I've experienced over the past years. Would you agree?
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like, and by the way, in no way am I criticising you or any other teacher here, Ellie, but it doesn't sound like what I said before, which is it's possible to have all learners learning at their own pace and at the exact challenge level that suits them. It doesn't sound like that. It feels like most people are doing things at the same time. Okay, maybe with differentiation bolted on, but it feels like that. And by the way, I recognise that classroom. I taught in an equivalent classroom with different skill sets and different content for nearly 20 years. So I'm not alien to it either. I'm just trying to open that discussion that maybe a different model is possible today.
Yeah, and I think that's partly one of the struggles I was having before I decided to leave teaching in the classroom, was this idea that this could be so much better, this could be so different. And I think I struggled a lot with the idea of wanting it to be so much better. I'm never okay with being okay. I don't like being that teacher kind of does, that's all right, they'll have to do. That didn't sit right with me, and unfortunately it probably nearly killed me at times when you're trying to make it the best experience possible and trying to find out the best way to help those students learn. You are trying to cope with the lad who's only just come back from Spain within your classroom, and the one who's perhaps been off sick for the past few months, hasn't done Spanish before, and trying to be very aware that you've got mock exams in 2 weeks and you haven't covered the content you're meant to have covered yet, and those sorts of things, and trying to teach in a way that I felt happy with, that I felt I was actually doing the best for my students, was something I felt I just couldn't do, if I'm perfectly honest. It was a battle I was fighting with constantly.
And I think also for me as well, it was that I felt that so much of it fell on me as well as a teacher, that the expectation was for me to make them learn. That was the other problem I encountered when I was in the classroom, that I was the one working hard so that they would learn, but I don't know how to explain it. I don't know if there was very little, I would say, just go and learn it, and they would have, because it's a different language and all, and there's a pronunciation with it, and that there wouldn't be so much they could do on their own without me being by their side, sort of thing. And maybe it was just me being paranoid and being like a bit like a mum role. But whilst maybe in other subjects they can go to a textbook, have a read, okay, yes, I understand this. Maybe again, it being a foreign language is a little bit, makes it seem to the student a little bit more difficult.
So let's go back to this presupposition. I said all learners learning at their own pace at the exact challenge level that suits them. How?
Well, with the model that we're working on then, with the Everlearner, I think it's completely It's completely possible, and it can be that so much better that I was always aspiring to. Where imagine if that brief recap of language that you need to do at the start of the lesson, that's already been prepared for you, and you could set off those students who need it, not those students who already can remember it. Those students who need it can set off, and they can watch the tutorial. They can then go and do the practice. You can then go and look back at how they're doing. Have they learnt it? Meanwhile, as the classroom teacher, you can be going and doing some one-on-one or small group speaking practice, not that test situation where they are being graded afterwards, encouraging them just to converse, just to actually speak in that foreign language with you. You can have the students off working in groups on a reading task, for example. So simultaneously within one lesson, all those 4 skills are actually being practiced all at the same time. And the vital importance, I think, the one thing I certainly really struggled with when teaching in the classroom was that speaking practice. I mean, the only way really to do it when you've got a class of 30, 35 students is to pair them off or put them in groups. And, you know, as you walk past them, they're saying, see. And then as soon as you walk past, you know full well they're going back to talking about something completely different.
Hollyoaks or something.
Yeah. And you never... You know, as much. I mean, I can honestly say I have had a few classes that stick in my mind, but they've been absolutely brilliant, and I know for a fact that 90% of them will be sitting there and speaking Spanish, but they're not getting input from me. So even if they are speaking Spanish, you know, they're not getting any help in terms of me perhaps noting down any vocab they need help with, or if they get stuck on a word, I'm not there to then help them out with that word.
See, feedback's very interesting because they're ultimately, unless they have a particularly skilled partner or group member within their peer group, they're ultimately not getting any form of feedback, whether corrective, directive or epistemic. They're not getting any.
And in a way, it could even be detrimental, because if you're paired up with someone whose level is lower, you may actually not want to show off as much, because you know that person may not understand you, and you may try and tone it down and make it simpler, because you know. So there's all these elements to bear in mind as well.
So it sounds like one of the key things that we want colleagues to consider is to switch off or to change the assumption that they are the mechanism for transmitting the one-pace-fits-all information to students. Is that fair?
Yes, definitely.
And I think what's really, sorry to interrupt, what's really useful as well is the fact that the student will have access to all the content as well. So if that student looks at the lessons and goes, well, I know countries, I know them inside out, I'm not going to, well, I can quickly do the test.
Exactly.
Yep, okay, I know I can do that. Off I go. And they can move on to the thing that's important to them. Or, for example, imagine setting the, marking a piece of written homework or something, and then realising actually that one particular student does need to recap their preterite versus imperfect tenses. You quickly set them that for them. But the other student in the class, however, needs help with a different aspect, needs to go back over the vocabulary of a topic, for example, or needs help with skills, which is something you could do on a one-to-one whilst all the other students are doing their work within the classroom. And I think that's a personalised feedback like that would be really invaluable. It's something that you try and explain whilst giving written feedback on a piece of work, and inevitably they'll come back to you and say, I don't quite understand, and you'll have to re-explain it to them. Or it's something you can address as a whole class, but it's rare that the entire class will need help with that one particular area. And I think that will transform the classroom, it will transform a teacher's workload as well.
I mean, it's quite a stunning assumption, isn't it? That, well, I guess it's not stunning because there are historical and cultural reasons for it, but the idea that the best way to present a classroom, whether in languages or any other subject, is to have all students, so all these different human beings who have all different backgrounds, all different levels of skill, all different levels of knowledge, all these different features of who they are, and we're going to take them through a period of teaching all at the same time, all at the same pace, all at the same rhythm, all of the same direction, and believe somehow that's the best way that information can be shared. I find that today a staggering belief, a stunning assumption. Not just because the assumption exists, but it's so embedded and ingrained in our school and educational culture. And that to me feels quite an extreme assumption. Or it feels like there's such a massive elephant in the room and people don't even seem to notice it's there. So I'm going to make another provocative statement to you guys. Ellie, Marta, why are French and Spanish, say, taught separately in separate classrooms at separate times?
Well, why they are, I think the answer is clear, because we still far and wide use the one-pace-fits-all method with delivery at the front. Of course, having a mixed group of French and Spanish learners listening to whatever, that is basically impossible. Now, if the question is, should it be this way? Does it always have to be this way? I suppose the answer is no. Probably at A level, for example, that might be necessary, because finding a teacher who's got an equally high level of Spanish and French, or of two languages at the level to teach A level, that might be, that is more complicated. So of course, if you're going to use big chunks of your lesson time for conversation, that might be difficult. Now, at GCSE level, it's probably more possible, and this, if managed appropriately, it could be done. Of course, at times, in any classroom, I suppose, even in this model, you may still want to do whole class activities. It's not like, right, you always have to work in small groups. Now, of course, if you found yourself in the situation where you have to have in the same classroom people learning French and people learning Spanish, yeah, you probably wouldn't be able to do those whole class activities. But other than that, I think it would be perfectly feasible to manage it in a way where the different languages are working, and you're sort of gravitating or going from one to the other.
How do you feel about it, Ellie? I mean, it's a provocative thing. Said there. It's actually direct response. I mean, who knows? This person might even be listening to this at some point. It's a direct response to a post I saw it's the Twitterati MFL group, isn't it? The MFL Facebook group. Mm-hmm. And a colleague was saying, I went into I don't remember the exact words, but I went into the meeting with an SLT colleague, and they asked me, is it possible to have French and Spanish, or it might be French and German, in the same classroom together? And this colleague was saying, I basically laughed and scoffed at them because it was the most ludicrous thing I could possibly imagine. And I don't know, how do you feel about that?
No, I had I been that teacher, I probably would have had the same reaction.
Agree, yeah.
But to be honest, I've had classes where I've had, for example, I've been teaching Spanish, but I've had a child and they're learning French at the same time, because they're aware that I can teach both. That student couldn't do it according to timetabling reasons. And I've got to be honest, like for a good 10-15 minutes, I'd forget that there was a child and they're meant to be doing a different language. I'm like, oh my goodness, they're probably finished by now, and I'd rush over and help them with it. So, I have done it. I haven't done it successfully, and it's only been with one or two students mixed in. But now knowing the sort of the model classroom that we could have, I can see it be very much, as long as the master said, you've got the teacher, obviously has to be able to speak Spanish, be able to teach French and Spanish, or whichever two languages we're referring to. Yeah. Then there's nothing.
So I suppose that's the key, isn't it? When you think of a classroom, what image comes into your mind? If the image is the teacher standing in front, yeah, it is a ludicrous idea.
It can't be done, I agree with that.
Exactly. If the image is people working at their own pace, and the teacher managing that and enabling that to happen, then
I think certain times, it's in particular skills lessons, or the build up to exam time. If you've ever had a class of dual linguists, so the ones who are doing two languages to GCSE level, I will often draw upon, if I know that, for example, they've already done writing technique in their other language, I'll draw upon that knowledge already. Yeah. And so it doesn't matter what language you're doing it in, the exam technique will be the same. Mm-hmm. And it used to happen a lot at A level as well, didn't it? When if you're teaching, there were quite a few dual linguists at A level, and actually it saved a lot of time knowing that they'd already covered that technique already. You just have to basically switch the vocabulary and the grammar, and
I mean, what I would say is, I mean, if the question is it ideal? Maybe it isn't. Because of the extra, and also the having to switch between one language and the other, you may end up a bit sort of, losing your mind a little bit. But it is possible. Is it possible? It is. I mean, the only thing is, of course, it requires a lot of preparation beforehand, because of course you have to have everything set up and know exactly where you're going, what resources students are going to be using from here. They're going to go to there. So you can't do an on the spot. Right, let's do something. But
I think what's interesting about that is you're right. It's not a pick up and go lesson. But if you look at the total planning for, say, a GCSE French course and
once
GCSE
it's planned,
there's it's literally identical.
Yeah, and once you've done once you've done the planning, and once you've got the resources,
in fact, it's less, because you don't have to plan the transmission.
Yeah.
Which I think I think that there's 2 or 3 formats where that question I think becomes relevant. One is one of the experience I believe is currently common within schools, and especially schools with 6 forms, is small course numbers on more elevated courses. Let's say A level for a second. 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s on French and Spanish and German, and that's very hard for a school to maintain financially, to be able to put whatever 5 hours a week of a teacher in those spaces. I completely accept your point that, let's say, having a French and German specialist who is sharp enough that they can develop students to the level required in both of those disciplines, I guess that individual's quite rare. But we're not talking necessarily about having fewer teachers. If we take that model where you'd have the French A level, the German A level, those would, right now, both be costed with 1 teacher. So we've just assumed that we take 1 teacher away. I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying within the timetable, it would be structured together. Or it could be your 12s and 13s within French, within Spanish, for example. And if students are moving at their own pace, at their own challenge level, on experiences which are specifically relevant to them, with the assumption that the transmission of information was removed from the classroom teacher and owned by I don't mean the classroom teacher isn't an expert, by the way, by an expert teacher in a self-paced methodology, my presupposition is that is entirely possible. I take your point. Is it ideal, desirable, the best way? It's arguable the best way is the model we're talking about within one subject discipline. I do think you may have a point with that one, but at least this gives people
the chance,
options, choices, different scenarios.
Exactly.
Even in the case of having 1 student who's from another discipline.
If the option, if the choice is between having two languages in one classroom or getting rid of languages, then I think it is definitely worth doing the 2 languages in one classroom, definitely, and at a time where pupils who are studying languages numbers keep falling, especially at A level, but it seems to also be the case at GCSE. It's something probably worth thinking about for many people, or at least start considering what would happen if I got that the question was posed, or my SLT came and asked me, what do you think about this? Would there be a way? Maybe there isn't.
And I think that question must be more common than people realise. And I guess if you get asked that question by SLT, it's probably not unloaded as a question. I mean, it's probably got some context coming with it, I suppose. Okay, Ellie, let's finish here. What from your perspective is the vision for the Everlearner and MFL? Where do you think this is going to go?
I think, knowing that we're approaching launch time, it's really exciting to be able to actually start seeing this working in the classroom. And I think when people start to actually give it a go, and I think sometimes you asked earlier about what the languages teacher's reaction might be. I think it's something you'll need to try it and see how well this could work. Hopefully just by talking about it, people realise how this could work. When I first joined and we discussed sort of the company and what we were aiming for and everything else, I could immediately think of so many classrooms, so many lessons that I've taught that have just been completely transformed by using this model. I think you asked me, would I go back to teaching in the classroom? I sort of said, well, actually, with this model on board, actually, it would take away a lot of those issues that I was struggling with before I left. So I'd like to see, ideally, more classrooms where speaking is actually taking place with the teacher every single lesson, and I think that's a dream that it would have been a dream a few months ago. Or knowing, for example, I think every language teacher listening will probably have the same experience of exam time, when you take your chair outside the classroom, you take one student at a time with you, and you fire some questions at them and you mark their response. Well, it's meanwhile keeping one ear and one eye on your classroom and seeing what on earth's going on the inside, and they're supposedly getting on with some work by themselves. To think actually that completely got away with, that's not going to be how it is anymore. And knowing that you'd be able to teach that lesson with the native speaker and the student who's never learnt that language before, and students will be able to learn at their own pace, and real targeted feedback for every individual student. As I said, it's all those things. You used to sit back and try and plan a lesson and think that it's wanted. Yeah, it really does.
Yeah.
So thinking, if only I could do that, if I could think of a way. And of course, if you're teaching a normal timetable, it's just things that you just never, you might have had a second to think about, and then thought, that's just, how am I going to do that? Yeah. And you just get on and you have to deal with, that's going to have to be enough, that will have to do. And then, you shut your planner and go home for the day, and then you start the next day, and you inevitably come out. I certainly would have found myself a bit disappointed with the lessons I was teaching, knowing that actually it wasn't right for every student within there. That's a really tricky one as well. I mean, obviously you can't be a different person that you are in the future by going back to the past, but I almost, and perhaps listeners to this won't know, I've been working this model for about 5 years, so in a different discipline. And I almost want to go back to the students I worked with before I was doing this and apologise to them that I didn't realise, that I didn't figure it out until later on. And obviously it's a bit of a dumb thought really, because it doesn't really help anybody. But it does give you that sensation of, or if you take it forwards from here, that's the way I do actually want it to be. And I want to mould it around the person that I am and that the students are. And have that kind of individualised experience. I also think for the teacher's experience of being in a classroom and being in a school, this is so much nicer. This is so much better just to be a human being in this environment. I mean, the continuous grind, I think, the day-to-day grind that teachers experience, do they know, who's telling them it's not necessary to be like that? Doesn't have to be like that. It can be different. I think the problem though when you're teaching, as I said before, is having the time, having the energy to consider. I remember a few years back we started looking into the idea of what was called flipped learning back then. So me going home and I'd record, I was focusing on grammar at the time, record a grammar lesson and ask the students then to watch it at home, and then in the classroom I'd then be teaching the lesson. It was something that we were trialling, and actually it really had its advantages. However, me trying to manage that workload was just impossible, quite frankly. We can't have a structure where every individual teacher has to do that. It's not structurally. It would be a very poor mechanism. And I think one of the things I draw out of this conversation is that you two are real linguists compared to me. I fancy myself a bit as a linguist. And I've had a go. I've never. It's a hobby. Yeah, it is a hobby for me. Really, I enjoy languages, and it's a passion for me. And you guys are more studied, academic, serious linguists. And you guys are also, in addition to that, you're also hyper experienced in the classroom, hyper polite, hyper positive. And you guys, I think, are going to role model what this classroom can be. I see my personal role as quite different, and I want language teachers to know it. I am going to provoke you, and I am going to poke you, and I am going to tell you it can be different, and you may hate me on days because I'm going to do it. And these guys, that'll probably mean that these two are more the face of what we're talking about, but that's what I'm going to see
my role as. And I'm going to be honest with you, Martin, it's something I think we're all going to need to be prepared for, is in that languages community, I am going to shout this loud. Because from what we've discussed here, I think it can really help a whole bunch of people, students and teachers both. So I'm going to shout loud, I'm going to shout it unapologetically and proudly about this, and then obviously you guys can mop up the aftermath.
We'll do that, don't worry, James.
So so let's wrap things up there. Thank you very much for your time today. It's been really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll get this posted out.
Brilliant.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you.